the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Linda in Lexington, Kentucky, you're on the air. Welcome.
Hi, Patrick. I have a real quick
Linda.
question about the Crusades. I have a son that's pulled away from the Catholic Church probably since all the abuse scandal in 2002. And he and I were speaking on the phone briefly the other day, and he was saying negative things about the Catholic Church and the Crusades. What I'm asking is a real quick summary to give him a direction to find truth.
Okay, a few questions. How old is he?
36. He always speaks to me respectfully, but he got a little heated, like, Mom, you don't even understand the Crusades. And
Yeah. I would say most people, and your son is, I'm almost certain, included in this number, most people have no idea what the Crusades really were, what they really did, why they really happened, because the popular notion about the Crusades is almost entirely wrong. And in fact, Nancy and I were on this pilgrimage in England and Scotland the past couple of weeks, following in the footsteps of the English martyrs. And along the way, the issue of the Crusades came up. And not somebody in our pilgrimage group, but just somebody I was talking to, was reacting negatively about the Catholic Church because of the Crusades. So I said, well, what do you know about the Crusades? And he said, well, the Crusades were this money-hungry, rapacious Catholic effort to go to the Holy Land and persecute Muslims and kill Muslims and take their stuff and force them to become Catholic. And that's a very common misunderstanding. So I took a little time and I walked him through the basics. It's exactly the opposite. So let's start there. Why did the Crusades happen at all? Well, the easy answer to that is simply that when Islam began to radiate outward from the Arabian Peninsula and by the way, from the very beginning, it began conquering lands within the Arabian Peninsula through military force. And when the Muslims gained enough power politically and militarily and financially, then they went outward, and rather than seeking to convert people with a peaceful message and let's preach to them and let's serve them and all the things that Catholics do by way of sending missionaries and so forth, what they did is they simply conquered territory as they got there. And as a general principle, it is true that they did show mercy in some cases, but often they showed no mercy. And it was either you convert to Islam and renounce Jesus, or you die. Take your pick. Or if we have mercy on you and you don't convert to Islam, we won't kill you, but you will be a dhimmi. And this is a word in Arabic that means essentially a third-class citizen. You live as a third-class citizen under the rule of Muslims, and there were all sorts of requirements and restrictions placed upon dhimmis, or the Christians who wouldn't convert, but they were allowed to live, but their stuff was confiscated. In many cases, women were taken as sex slaves, etc. There were all kinds of terrible things that went on. And gradually what happened was when this began to reach the holy sites in the land of Israel, so you have the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where people from like in the 300s and 400s, they were going on pilgrimages there. They were going on pilgrimages to the places where Jesus lived, and of course in Jerusalem where he died and rose from the dead. And so the Muslims would take these places over, knock them down in some cases, and build mosques. And say, sorry, we're not going to do that Catholic thing anymore. And no, you can't have Mass. And no, you can't have public celebrations because this is ours now. And so when the popes began to hear about this, and the kings and emperors in Europe, etc., began to hear about this, they said, as George H.W. Bush once said, this will not stand. So in the year 1095, Pope Urban II, he said, this is ridiculous. Our people are being slaughtered. They're being forcibly converted by the Muslims. The holy places are being confiscated. Their lands are being taken from them. Their homes, the churches, etc., are being demolished. We have to do something. So Pope Urban II, he called for this. This would be the first major crusade. And there's a difference in how many there were. Some people say 10, some people say 7. But in any case, each of these intended, at least originally, to go and liberate the Christian folk who had been subjugated and their stuff confiscated by the Muslims. They didn't go over there to convert Muslims to the Catholic Church. That's a myth. The Catholic Church did not send armies, and this was raised by kings and others, but I mean, the popes called for, hey, we've got to go help our brethren. We've got to go help these people because there's nothing else to do. We either sit here in the relative comfort of our castles in Europe, or we go and risk our lives and we try to help these people. And that's what they did. So at its fundamental root, that was the stated purpose for the Crusades. Now, yes, there were some Catholic bad actors. There were some who were in it for the plunder and for the booty and for, fighting and all that. But that was never the intention behind the Crusades at all. And yes, some crusaders did terrible things like the sacking of Constantinople, for example. A fellow Catholic country, and they went over there and they brutalized their fellow Catholics / Eastern Orthodox folk on their way to the Holy Land. And that was terrible. So we're not excusing, I certainly don't excuse or try to explain away or ignore the terrible things that were at times done. But the fundamental purpose of the Crusades was to liberate these subjugated, mistreated, overrun Catholic folk who had done nothing wrong, but they were being persecuted this way by the Muslims. That's the reality in its most basic form. So if you're interested, I wrote a whole chapter on this topic in my book called Pope Fiction. Pope Fiction, Answers to 30 Myths and Misconceptions about the Papacy. And there's a whole chapter in there just on the Crusades and what actually happened and what the Crusades were. It's not a long chapter, but it will give you a basic overview. And it also gives you a number of resources, books that you can read. So, for example, The Crusades, it's an historical overview of the Crusades written by Regine Pernoud, Pernoud, and this came out in 1960. And there are a number of other really helpful books. I would say start with that one. Very helpful historical analyses of what the Crusades really were and what they really did. And it, warts and all, including the bad things as well. So perhaps you can get your son to listen or to read that if you want to. You can pick up a cheap used copy online for pennies. I would also recommend, and this is, I believe his name is Bill Warner, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Bill Warner. And he has produced a lot of good multimedia presentations. He's an historian. And he has done really helpful work on the Crusades, not so much the Crusades, rather, but the conquest of the greater Mediterranean basin by Muslims. And he shows all the different battles and things. His website is called Political Islam, politicalislam.com. And what I would recommend for your son would be to show him, you can text him these videos that are highly detailed, they're meticulously documented in showing the way in which Islam spread into the world and the countless conquests and battles and wars that were fought against Christians. And I think that'll give him a very different perspective of what's really going on here. Now, I don't know Bill Warner. My impression is he might even be an atheist. I don't believe he's a believer, but he certainly got it locked down when it comes to the facts of what's going on. We will leave it at that. But let me know in a few months, Linda, if this is helpful to your son. You can join me by listening to The Patrick Madrid Show on the Relevant Radio app, live each weekday at 8 to 11 a.m. And thanks for listening.